This was back in 2015. I had taken a road trip to a forest a few hours from where I lived. There was a hike that led up to an abandoned fire lookout, and I was really excited to explore it. I should mention it was technically illegal to go inside or camp in the lookout. It hadn't been maintained in years, and there were concerns it might be structurally unstable. I had done some research online beforehand. Most people said it seemed fine, but the last post I could find about it was from 3 years earlier. So honestly, I had no idea what I'd find when I got up there. Eventually, I found a small ditch on the side of the road where I could park my car. I grabbed my backpack, which had about 2 days' worth of gear, and started the hike. With trips like this, there usually aren't any clearly defined trails. I used a handheld satellite GPS to make sure I was heading in the right direction. But really, I was just cutting through unknown terrain deep in the woods. The hike from the road took about 4 to 5 hours. And the deeper I got, the more dense and difficult the terrain became. I was really banking on that fire lookout still being intact, hopefully solid enough to camp out in. If it wasn't, I figured I'd just find a spot nearby to pitch my tent. After several exhausting hours of hiking, I finally reached my destination. I could see the building peeking above the treetops. As I got closer, it actually looked to be in decent shape. The paint was weathered and peeling, of course, but the structure itself seemed to be holding up well. I gave the support beams a few good pushes, they felt solid. So, I decided to try my luck climbing up the ladder. It was made of metal and felt sturdy, though it creaked with every step I took upward. When I got to the top, I was in awe. The view was incredible. I could see nearly the entire forest stretched out below me, no buildings, no roads, no houses. Just miles and miles of untouched woods in every direction. After taking it all in for a minute, I stepped around the ledge and went inside the lookout. It was small, not like those big fire towers you see turned into Airbnbs or rentals. This was just one room, maybe 150 square feet. There was a decaying bed in one corner, and in the opposite corner, an old wooden desk. The walls were lined with rotting windows, giving a nearly panoramic view of the forest. There wasn't much else to explore, so I dropped my backpack, rolled out my sleeping mat and bag, and heated up a meal on my mini camping stove. Once the sun started to set, I stepped back out onto the ledge and sat down to watch. It was, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful sunsets I'd ever seen, but it felt like it went by fast. And before I knew it, the sky was pitch black. The clouds had rolled in, too, so there was no moonlight, no stars, just complete darkness. Still, I stayed on the ledge for a while longer. There was nothing else to do, and the silence was kind of peaceful. Probably about an hour into the night, I noticed something. There was a light moving down in the trees. At first, I thought it might have been a flashlight, but something about it felt off. The light wasn't steady. It had this orangish hue, and it flickered kind of like a fire. Like a torch. Whoever it was, they were moving between the trees, not too far from the base of the lookout. It didn't make sense. The odds of someone else being out here, in this remote of a spot, at the same time as me? Pretty much zero. Especially since there wasn't even a trail to get here. And the fact that they were walking through the forest at night using a torch instead of a flashlight? That was even stranger. I watched the flickering light weave through the trees for a while. Then it slipped behind something and disappeared from view. For the next 30 minutes, the light never reappeared. I stayed out on the ledge anyway, just taking in the calmness and silence of the night. It was peaceful in a way, still and undisturbed. Eventually, the wind started to pick up and the chill in the air made me decide it was time to head inside. I stood up, planning to take one last look at the view before calling it a night. But when I looked down over the ledge, someone was there. They were standing in the grassy clearing between the fire lookout and the woods right at the base of the structure. It looked like they were staring straight up at me. Maybe it was the same person with the torch I had seen earlier. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just called out, "Hello?" They didn't respond. They didn't move. We just stood there in this bizarre silence for 10, maybe 15 seconds, staring at each other. Then, without a word, the person slowly raised their hand. It wasn't a wave exactly, more like a small gesture. Like they were acknowledging me or maybe apologizing. After that, they turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. No flashlight. No torch. Just gone. It was incredibly eerie, yeah. But for some reason, in that moment, I convinced myself it was probably just another hiker. Maybe they were planning to stay at the lookout too and were just checking if someone was already inside. Still, why didn't they say anything? Why just that strange hand gesture? I stayed out for a little while longer, scanning the tree line. But when nothing else happened, I headed inside and climbed into my sleeping bag to warm up. It was tough to fall asleep. The wind rattled the windows and the wooden beams beneath me creaked with every gust. But eventually, I must have drifted off. I don't know how long I was asleep, but when I woke up, everything was still. The wind had stopped and the forest outside was pitch black. I opened my eyes, confused. I wasn't sure what had woken me until I heard it. That soft, familiar creak of metal. The sound of the ladder. At first, I thought I had imagined it. I sat up slowly, holding my breath. Then I heard it again. And again. Someone was climbing the ladder. I couldn't see anything out the windows, it was too dark. And I couldn't tell how far up they were. But I could hear the metal hinges at the top of the ladder groaning with every step. I unzipped my sleeping bag and stood up, heart pounding. I grabbed my backpack and stepped out onto the ledge. In the 20 or so seconds it took me to move, the creaking grew louder and faster. Whoever it was, they were climbing quickly. Then, just as I stepped out onto the ledge, the sound stopped. I stood still for a moment, holding my breath and waiting for another sound. Nothing. Slowly, I began to walk around the narrow wooden walkway, moving cautiously toward the corner where the ladder opened up. My pulse was racing as I peered around the edge. No one was there. I stepped a little closer and leaned over the side, staring down. The ladder was empty. There was nobody on it. I froze for a second, confused, scared, completely unsure of what was happening. My mind raced through every possibility, but nothing made sense. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Fast, heavy, rushing across the wooden walkway behind me. I spun around just in time to see a dark figure dart past the windows on the opposite side. Just a glimpse, but enough to know I wasn't alone. I didn't hesitate. I dropped down onto the ladder and began climbing down as quickly as I could. The metal rungs were slick, and my whole body was shaking from the adrenaline. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life, knowing someone was just above me while I was trapped on that narrow ladder. About halfway down, I looked up. Their head peeked out from the top. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just kept going until my feet hit the ground and I ran straight into the woods. To this day, I don't know why I had grabbed my backpack before stepping outside, but it was the best decision I ever made. Maybe it even saved my life, because inside were the two things I needed most: my flashlight and my handheld GPS. With those, I was able to find my way back through the forest, all the way to my car. As far as I know, I wasn't followed. I got in, started the engine, and drove away, without ever looking back. I was camping at a small lake for the weekend. Really, this wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a few peaceful days in the woods by the water to relax and unwind. Nothing more. The first day went exactly like that. I arrived, set up camp, and just chilled for the rest of the day and night. This place was pretty remote. There was a thin footpath that led to it, but it wasn't marked on any maps online. It was one of those hidden spots only locals would know about. My dad used to take me here when I was a kid. Over the years, I kept coming back, sometimes with him, sometimes by myself. And in all that time, not once did I ever run into another person out there. Honestly, I'd never even seen signs that anyone else had ever been there. No garbage. No campfire remains. Nothing. Anyway, on my second day, I spent most of it walking around the lake. Just taking it easy, letting my mind wander. I think I circled the lake 3 or 4 times. The entire time, everything was quiet. Peaceful. Nothing out of place. But then on one of my laps, I noticed something strange. There were footprints. Fresh ones. They were pressed into the dirt just along the edge of the tree line. I had been walking that same loop around the lake over and over, and I never saw those footprints before. Where they were, it was so clear, so obvious. I don't think there was any way I could have missed them earlier. They also looked fresh. But what really creeped me out wasn't just that someone else had been out there, it was what kind of footprints they were. They weren't shoe prints. They were barefoot. Literal human footprints with toes and everything. No tread marks. No boots. Just bare feet. And here's the thing, this part of the lake didn't have any easy access to the water. It's not like someone took off their shoes for a swim. If they had, I definitely would have seen them in the water. That made it worse. It meant someone had walked out there, alone, barefoot, and then vanished into the woods without a trace. Something about it just unnerved me. It got under my skin. Why didn't I ever see them? Were they hiding? Watching me? Waiting until I passed before stepping out? It was hard not to let my thoughts spiral into paranoia. From what I could tell, the footprints led up to the edge of the trees, facing the lake, then turned around and went straight back into the woods. They disappeared into the underbrush beyond where I could see. I had no desire to follow them. Instead, I turned around and walked back to my campsite. Every now and then, I'd glance back at the trees, at the lake, at the shadows between the branches. I never saw anyone, but as the sun started to go down, the feeling of unease crept in again. Those footprints just didn't sit right with me. They felt wrong, and the idea that whoever made them might still be nearby, it was far from comforting. When night fell, I gathered more wood and built up my fire, higher than I normally would have. Then I sat there beside it, watching the tree lean, waiting. I did whatever I could to keep my mind off the footprints, but it was difficult. Part of me felt justified in being uneasy. The other part thought maybe I was just overreacting. But not too far into the night, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps coming from the trees. I instantly turned to face the darkness. It wasn't just one person. It sounded like two people, slowly walking toward my campsite. I stared in the direction of the sound until they finally stepped into view. A man and a woman. They walked side by side and stopped just at the edge of where the firelight reached. They stood there, completely still. I could barely make out their features. Just two human shapes, standing in silence. I couldn't even tell how old they were. Their faces were shadowed. Their clothes were dark. They looked like silhouettes. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice more tense than I wanted it to sound. As soon as I spoke, the woman turned and sprinted back into the woods. No hesitation. Just gone. But the man stayed. He didn't move. He didn't react. He didn't even look in the direction she ran. That's when I noticed he wasn't wearing any shoes. Those had to be the people who left the bare footprints around the lake. I asked again if I could help him. He didn't answer. He just turned around and slowly walked back into the woods, disappearing behind the trees. I had a full-blown internal panic after that. It was the most unsettling thing I'd ever experienced. The whole interaction felt wrong, off, like something out of a dream. Or a nightmare. I didn't want to spend another second in those woods. I immediately started packing my things. I'm not the kind of person who sticks around when things start getting weird. Luckily, my setup was simple. I had everything packed and tied down in my bag in just a few minutes. I had no idea where they went. I didn't care. I just knew I didn't want to be around if they came back. I kicked the unlit logs out of the fire so it would burn out shortly after I left. Then I grabbed my bag, threw it over my shoulder, and hurried into the woods. The walk back to my truck was nearly 2 hours. For the first 10 minutes, I was completely on edge, constantly checking behind me, wondering if I was being followed. But the further I got, the better I felt. Until about 40 minutes in, the woods had gone totally silent. No wind, no bugs, not even crickets. Then, out of nowhere, I heard running footsteps. They were distant, maybe 100 feet off to my side, but definitely human. I couldn't see anything in the dark, so I just kept walking, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later, I heard them again, this time on the other side of me. The footsteps were lighter than they should have been. Too quiet. It almost sounded like they were barefoot, which made me believe it was the same two I saw at the lake. If they had followed me this far, I didn't want to think about what their intentions were. The rest of the walk, I kept hearing those short bursts of running. Always off in the distance. Never close. Like they were stalking me, watching me, and then sprinting off whenever I got too close to noticing them. I can't think of anything more terrifying than that walk. But somehow I made it. I reached my truck, got in, and drove away. I never saw them again. I wish I had more answers. I wish I knew who they were or what they were doing out there. Sometimes I wonder if they were even alive at all. But honestly, I don't want to know. And I've never gone back. I'm a 24-year-old woman from northern Arizona, and this happened a couple of years ago. At the time, I was living out of a small camper van, traveling along the West Coast. There's a lot of different lifestyles out there. Many people choose to live in vans or RVs, and I've been doing it for a while. I always preferred staying out of the big cities and sticking to small towns when I could. But most of the time, I enjoyed camping out in the backcountry. Being in the middle of the woods with nobody around was where I felt most comfortable. That's where I truly enjoyed the lifestyle of traveling. I think part of it was that I always felt safer out there by myself in the forest rather than trying to stealth camp in a busy parking lot in the middle of a city. Don't get me wrong, sometimes it could get creepy at night. But I always knew I was better off in the wilderness where it was peaceful and I didn't have to worry about anyone. That week, I was slowly making my way between two big cities in Washington. I was taking my time, sticking to the back roads and spending several days at a time at different campsites. On that day, I pulled off the main road and onto a small dirt trail heading deep into the forest. There were a few pull-off spots along the trail, but none were taken and it looked like nobody had been down here in a while. So I kept going, hoping to find a larger and more scenic spot. At the end of the trail, there was a large, open circle to pull off into. It wasn't particularly scenic, just surrounded by trees, but it was large, secluded, and peaceful. In the center, there was a stone circle perfect for a campfire. I leveled out my van and parked. Since it was the middle of spring, it rained almost every day here in Washington, so there wasn't much for me to do outside. I opened the side door of my van for some fresh air while I cooked a meal on my propane stove. It was around sunset, so I still had several hours before I'd be heading to bed. Over the next 30 minutes, the sun dipped past the horizon and the rain started picking up. I shut the door to keep the water out and cracked open one of the small windows near the back of the van. I sat on the bed and watched a show on my laptop. But midway through, I saw a glare coming from the open window behind me. It was a light reflecting onto the screen of my laptop. Before I had a chance to react, the glare disappeared. It didn't move away, it turned off as if someone had switched it off. I turned around and looked out the window but saw nothing. It was dark and the rain was still pouring outside. I had no way of knowing how far the light had come from or what it even was. Being on a trail with other pull-off spots, I had to assume it was just another camper. Maybe their headlights somehow found their way through the trees and shone into my window. Then they quickly turned their vehicle off. The only problem with that theory was the light didn't come from the road I had come down. Behind my window was just trees. Maybe there was another trail I didn't know about. There wasn't much investigating I could do, so I turned back around and focused on my laptop. Occasionally, I'd check the windows or think I'd heard something outside. But with the rain clanking against the metal roof, it wasn't clear if I was actually hearing something or not. Every time I looked, though, I never saw anything to confirm there was something out there, so I didn't worry myself too much. I want to say it was about 10 or 11 when I decided to call it a night and try to sleep. I turned off everything in the van, closed all the windows, and drew the shades. It was nearly pitch black inside. I got under the covers and tried to sleep. Usually, I didn't have much trouble at all, but tonight, I just couldn't manage to fall asleep. Unfortunately, the rain picked up even more after an hour and thunder started rolling in. It was so loud it made it impossible to even try to sleep. About 2 hours into the night, through all the harsh rain and thunder, I swear I heard something move outside. It was just loud enough for me to know I really heard something. It sounded like someone or something running and kicking over a branch on the ground somewhere just outside of my van. As soon as I heard it, there were no other sounds. It was so dark I couldn't even see the ground beneath the window. The longer I looked out there, the more uneasy I felt. I just had this feeling like someone else was looking back at me. I put the window cover back down. I sat there and tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but only a minute later, I heard a voice. It was a male voice, kind of in a loud whisper like they were talking to someone else. I sat in silence, too scared to open the covers and look out the windows again, knowing they'd probably see me if they hadn't already. However, they likely already assumed someone was in the van, which made it all the more terrifying. There was a good 2 or 3 minutes where I didn't hear anything aside from the rain and thunder before something suddenly happened outside the sliding side door to the van. It sounded like bending plastic, like someone was leaning against the side door. Then there was a knock. A few seconds later, they knocked again. Even though I was sure they knew I was in here already, I still was too scared to speak. Maybe they weren't sure how many people were inside or if I was a man or a woman. So I felt safer not giving them anything and just staying quiet. A very disturbing and anxious 5 minutes went by as the knocking continued every few seconds without anyone saying anything. They had to be drenched by now and probably couldn't see at all through the weather. But then they finally said something. "Sheriff's Department, open up." What? I didn't believe that for a second. If it were true, why wouldn't they have said that from the beginning? They continued knocking and calling out different lines, all basically stating that they were an officer and I needed to open the door. This seemed like a desperate attempt to get me to open up without violence. I slowly lifted the window cover and looked out. All I could see was a dark figure moving near the door, but from the shape of it, it didn't look like he had any sort of law enforcement gear on, so I was sure this was about to get really bad. I debated in my head what to do for 30 seconds as it felt like the knocking got more and more impatient. Then I decided to risk it, getting into the driver's seat and trying to drive away. As soon as I went up there and turned the car on, I heard 2 sets of footsteps running up to the side of the van. I began pulling out just as a figure appeared in the window next to me. Thank God the van didn't get stuck and I was able to get out onto the trail. As I drove away, I never saw any other vehicle down the road, which makes the intentions of these unknown people likely really disturbing. I put in a report with the county, who, of course, said no officers were out there that night. But I never got any follow-up. Things could have gotten really bad out there, but I haven't had anything else happen since then.